we've been living through Striketober and now Striketember, this strike wave that I think you kind of called it at some. I think you were on some show. I saw you. I think you did kind of predict this. So my question for you is really, how are you thinking about what we've been seeing in these last few months? Like, what do you think explains this militancy? Do you think overall these have been successful strikes? And do you see signs that this could be maybe the beginning of like a protracted period of labor unrest, or do you see this as more of a short-term thing?
Oh my God, so many questions. I had to write them all down. It was so exciting. No, it's okay. It's good. We like lots of questions all at once. Yes, I definitely have spent a lot of time and several books trying to articulate, certainly the recent one, A Collective Bargain, and then No Shortcuts, trying to articulate that we are going to hit a place where workers actually start saying enough of this crap, you know what I mean, already. And so I think we are seeing that. On the other hand, I thought you were going to say that you heard me say in interviews something I was also saying more recently, which is, first of all, I don't like the word wave. That's a personal thing. And I'm going to keep saying that. I'm not sure that this is really a strike wave yet. I think it is. I think there are several things happening, and we could really miss the moment. And that's why it's actually great to be here to talk to you for a little while today. I mean, we're in a sort of tighter labor market, right? So the conditions are sort of ripe for us to take advantage of them. The question is, will we? Will we? I mean, I think it's a really fair question at this point, because there have been other moments in time in history when we have had a tight labor market like today. Tight labor market meaning, unemployment is officially down. Workers are quitting in droves, and there's a lot of talk out there that gives workers more power. Well, it does, but so far, and we'll come back to Striketober, November, December, and I hope something better in 2022. But I think I think most of what we've seen so far is the manifestation of like the 50-year cultural war called neoliberalism that has reconditioned, like over decades, people to think and act individually versus collectively, right? That's why I call the new book A Collective Bargain. Like, I'm trying to constantly get the word collective bargain and collective back in our discussion. So the big quit, the great resignation, 12 to 14 million Americans quitting their job just since April, record high in July, then we broke the record again in August, then we broke the record again in September. So the narrative was like the big quit, the great resignation, all the focus was on that. And then once 10,000 workers at John Deere walked off the job and challenged both their national union and what their national union was recommending that they accept, and challenged the John Deere Corporation in the middle of a raging pandemic, that one act by 10,000 mighty workers in a supermajority strike really shifted the narrative right away. Now, imagine what would have happened had IATSE and 60,000 workers in the stagehand union actually gone on strike. Imagine what would have happened had the Kaiser strike actually played out with an additional 50,000. These were the sort of the strike threats that were being discussed that were leading to sort of the Striketober narrative shift at least in the media. And I'm going to still argue two things. One, when I look back at the whole year, which, it's that time of year when we're all looking at what happened this year. When I look back at the whole year, I still think the massive challenge for organizers is how to channel this individual, like, I quit. There's even several stories recently highlighting that workers are like going onto Instagram and whatever social media they use before they walk in their boss's office and quit, and like saying it on Instagram and like filming themselves quitting. So there's this like individual militancy and individual anger, but we got to see way more of the kind of collective action that John Deere workers took, or that Kellogg and many other workers have been taking this year, before we're going to get to the place where we're creating a kind of crisis that's going to force the mansions, the cinemas, and frankly, we know there's a bunch of Democrats hiding behind them, frankly, right? But those two are, like, I call them the public face of resistance to all good things. There are definitely a bunch of moderate Democrats who are like, don't ever back down. That crap is happening. That's actually how it works. So we got two of them who have the balls to be the front of resistance to like actual fundamental structural change. And they're not going to change their mind unless and until more workers take the action that the John Deere workers took, unless more workers actually say, yeah, no, we're walking off the job in a supermajority strike and we ain't going back until our demands are met. That magnified many times over is the kind of power that's going to be desperately required in 2022 if we stand any damn chance of not sinking into Trumpism this time next year.
So I want to ask you about another sort of recent news item, which happened last week. It's of course the Buffalo Starbucks union. The reason why I wanted to ask you about this in particular is because obviously, on one hand, when any workplace, anywhere unionizes, it's a great day, right? But I also noticed that for this particular instance, there was basically a wave. Well, sorry to use that word, but like a wave of mainstream media coverage that sort of characterized this shop unionizing as historic, landmark, first of its kind. And obviously, again, it is the first Starbucks location to be unionized. But I want to put it into context a little bit because actually, Paul and I were talking off the show about what this unionization really means. I mean, we were saying, just looking at the media coverage, something like the Teamsters election, which also happened recently, did not get even a fraction of the coverage that the Starbucks unionization did, but will probably end up affecting way more people, right? So I suppose the question for you is, perhaps it's kind of a media question, but I guess the question is, do you think that the media coverage of this Starbucks unionization was outsized in any way or warranted? And then the follow-up is, what should we actually make of the union process, of the unionization of this Starbucks?
Yeah, really good questions. By the way, the whole discussion you were having was really good. Before I jumped in, I was thinking, oh my God, like you're talking about the Laura Skinner interview and the discussion about the Green New Deal. And how the work actually gets done, and then also about the packing house workers, both of which are in a chapter in A Collective Bargain, right? The chapter where I take on myths about the labor movement. So I was like, oh, we are right in the right discussion here. Why I always like to see all of you. So what does it mean? Was it overhyped? Having articulated some things that were overhyped in the media, and I'm sticking by it this year. Whether it was overhyped or not, probably, but let's think about it. A few reasons why. Some of the same ones as Bessemer and elsewhere, which is, Howard Schultz was a presidential candidate, right? So he isn't like the average CEO. Like the dude was actually considering himself, because he's so crazily arrogant, like actually considered himself someone who could run for president of the United States. That's like, oh my God, pull anyone out and run them if he can run. But anyway, so, he's got a particular, like he's an ideological warrior. So I think, as is Amazon, obviously, right? They're both ideological warriors in a class war against workers and just for the super rich. So, was it overhyped? Yeah, probably. It's a simple story. It's like the media comment is, since you raised the word media here, the media commentary, I think, is we have this, persistent problem for probably ever, I can just say in my lifetime, which is that most reporters have never been a member of sort of like, they've never worked outside of the work that they're doing, meaning that there's usually a very big class, and probably race and gender, right? But there's definitely a big class gap between reporters who make the decision about the headlines versus their experience on this planet before they became reporters. So that's one challenge. So they can all relate to Starbucks because they go shop there and they pick up their latte there, right? So it's like they're reaching for something that they relate to, which is a coffee shop. And then I do think the fact that Schultz is sort of a big national figure makes him deserving of more attention. Now, the question is, what do I really think about it? I mean, I'd like to say I agree with you that the Teamster election is potentially a much more significant, and as a bridge or a segue between that and something that relates to the Starbucks question, I'm not going to leave it yet. But what also happened last week was 17,000 academic researchers at the University of California system, 17,000 versus like 25 in a coffee shop in Elmwood or something, threatened to strike to demand recognition and won their union in what I call the old-fashioned way, which was they were prepared to do a supermajority strike and walk off the job. So we got 17,000 academic workers in the University of California last week, and we got like 25, or I'm not looking at the actual number, I remember it, but literally 30, 25 people in a store in Starbucks. I'm interested in the Teamsters using the method that the United Auto Workers were using with the academic student researchers in California to strike for recognition and get a 17,000 boom, right? So which is more valuable? I mean, it's interesting to compare them because they were within days of each other last week. Mm-hmm. And I think they do both matter, but I'm actually much more interested in the internal change at the United Auto Workers, right? There was also an internal democracy vote there, different then, but similar energy to what was happening in the Teamsters. The question is, can we actually turn that into something real? That's just because we change a leader. I mean, if we haven't learned just because we change a leader, we don't change anything, we're kidding ourselves for one. So what are the internal structures that are going to keep any new leadership accountable to sort of the promises, whether it's Biden or the slate that won at the Teamsters or the potential UAW's future, right? So we still need structures to force change, whether it's in our unions or in our broader society. So going back to the Starbucks thing really quickly, I mean, they're going to have a hell of a time getting a contract. I have a lot of thoughts for them. I don't want to do a whole show on it, but about how they might win one, but strategically. But what is in Schultz's interest? What is in the Starbucks CEO and president and the corporation's interest in giving those workers a first contract? Nothing. They're going to sit on them. They're going to punish them. I mean, I've been in scenarios where the boss realizes, oh my God, this is a Pandora's box to more unionization. If we let these workers, have a good contract or have any standard better than anyone else in the company, it's going to represent a huge threat. My guess is they would love to close the Starbucks. My guess is they haven't done it, that this is where you see the value of having the Biden administration, because we have to stretch ourselves to talk about where we see the advantages. But one advantage is the National Labor Relations Board. Certainly a decision to close that Starbucks, which is what most ruthless employers will do, right? With one small shop, just close it. Mm-hmm. That they're going to have a hard time doing. They could still do it, but it may happen. I have no idea. I'm not looking closely at this. It could still happen, but having Biden may prevent them from doing that, right? And having a labor board that's actually going to take action against an employer for an obviously egregious behavior. The easier thing for that boss to do is never give them a contract, run a decertification campaign 12 months from now, or never give them a contract and just never give them one, or offer them a contract that, has subpar, that's worse than everyone else. I've literally had bosses do that, like put something across the table to teach a lesson to workers that was worse than the human resource policies in the rest of the company. So all of those are the more likely scenario for what those Starbucks workers face. The question is, how the hell are they going to win a great contract? That's why I'm more interested in 17,000 workers at the University of California system who, won a union last week by threatening to strike. Because if you're ready to threaten to strike, and if there are more than 25 or 30 of you, then you got a hell of a chance to pull off a win. And we got to have win. Like people need to, we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. People got to see workers winning fundamental change in their lives in order to decide to take the risk to do what they just did, right? So that's going to be the challenge in the Starbucks work. I think it's important, but it's not. It's very important, but it's the issue you raised, I think, are more fundamental to what we need to see on scale.
And, with this heightened strike activity, there are more opportunities for whether it's progressive individuals or leftist organizations like DSA to do strike support. So can you talk about, first, why strike support is very important to do? And also, how should people go about doing this? I imagine many of our listeners are people who are not in unions, but are supportive of them, at least in the abstract. So how should people think about how would you start supporting strikes in concrete ways?
Ooh, so many. The first is that, sadly, this won't be true at the UAW and it won't be true at the Teamsters. But many other workers who are on strike, many of the workers who are on strike right now, actually a lot of the small strikes don't have a strike fund, aren't prepared sort of financially to deal with it. So the central first thing that everyone can do is contribute, like literally contribute to the strike fund. But that's one. And that's a fairly easy one. The other ones, though, that I like to talk about are shifting the narrative quickly and surrounding the workers with support, right? So that's calling up the local press, where we have local press. We still do. It does actually still matter. So reaching out to local newspapers, if you live in an area with a strike, reaching out, first of all, going to the picket line. Actually, I should just back up and say the very first thing is you got to ask the workers what they need, right? Like they're going to know whether it's the Green New Deal and how we transition or how to eradicate racism, besides a stupid audit that you were describing earlier, versus like winning a contract that eradicates racism in the contract, right? So we got to start by talking to the workers who are on strike. A big mistake is that a lot of people don't do that. And then they start doing things like taking to social media and calling for boycotts, which is actually not what the workers want, or whatever the example is. So start by getting down at the picket line and supporting them if you're not in a union. Secondly, ask them what they need. Then bounce off of their articulation of the things that they need, which are going to include money, but really, frankly, going to other power players in the broader community. If you're in their community, right, you have a lot of chances of things you can do. Reaching out to the media, demanding that people support them, standing with them, bringing down, huge delegations of your friends and comrades and allies to the picket line, setting up a parallel picket shift schedule that you can do yourselves, right? There's just a slew of ways that the rest of us can support other people's strikes. And it's frankly kind of urgent at this point. So it isn't just money. It's how do we actively show serious support for workers when they're on strike. It matters to them, like having been there. It matters to workers to feel like there are people actually standing with them on those ridiculously cold nights. We see all these lonely pictures of these workers standing on these picket lines, right, where they're actually trying to hold the line right now. And then frankly, it gets lonely and intense. The strike is like incredibly exciting when you're voting, incredibly exciting when you walk off, and it gets lonely pretty quickly unless there are people there supporting you. So that's really important. If you're far away, support the strike fund, write to the national media, demand, really good coverage by the national media. That's some of the basic stuff that people can do. And we have way more strikes coming up in the 2022, or we're just about to march straight into Trumpism again.
And so, speaking of the media, how they're covering labor, there's a lot of buzz around they're going to get a second shot at organizing at Bessemer. And so, you wrote an article at the time of the first vote, your thoughts on that. So, how do you think the union needs to approach this fight differently this time around?
Well, let's start by saying if they're just thinking about that right now, we're going to lose. So hopefully they've been thinking about that for a really long time. And I believe that they have been. I hope they have been. And frankly, the whole reason I wrote the story was, as I predicted, this is very important. If you read the end of the story, like in the last 3 paragraphs, I say, back in March, I said, they are in all likelihood gonna win their fight to have a second election. So I articulate that. No surprise to me at all. The violations were totally egregious. That wasn't the point. The point is, how do you actually organize when you have an A-level union busting campaign, which those of us who've been doing the work for a long time know has to be met with what we call an A-level organizing campaign, right? If you've got an A-level boss fight, you need an A-level organizing strategy. If you've got a B-level boss fight, or a C-level one, boss is asleep at the switch, shows up late, doesn't hire a good union buster, you got different ways that you have to attenuate how much power has to be brought to bear to the fight. Going into an Amazon fight or Starbucks, that's why the Starbucks thing was interesting. It's going to be an A-level boss fight, meaning they're going to intimidate, terrorize, scare, fire, fill in the blank, change their schedules. I mean, every one of these things done to workers in campaigns, which is part of what I said in the article, right? None of this crap is new. And that was my complaint about the media narrative, as if these were new tactics, putting the post box, do whatever. This is as old as capitalism. They do anything, right, when they're trying to stop a unionization drive. So the first thing is they have had to have been ongoing organizing to stand a chance at a second election this entire time. I hope they have been. And I can say that some people involved in the campaign, I will leave all their names out for fear that it gets them in trouble, reached out to me multiple times to thank me for writing the article, to say that they believed it would actually help reset the campaign internally. So there was, this was not, as I have said several times, I was talking to people who were involved in that campaign. And there was a lot of frustration for how it was being run. So their chances of winning, are, I think, steep right now. It's great that there's a labor board in place that will be, diligent. But when I wrote in No Shortcuts about going back to meatpacking, when I wrote in No Shortcuts about the Smithfield drive, part of what was so important. So Smithfield, sorry, for people who don't know, Smithfield was a massive election that happened in the South, the biggest Southern election in decades at the time, at the world's largest pork producer, just summed up quickly. And they had to go back at the apple 3 times. I actually argue, same union, different moment, but I argue, or same national union anyway, I argued that when I analyzed the campaign, that it wasn't just because labor law was broken. That wasn't the only reason they lost the first election or the second election. They had bad strategy, right? I'm focused on strategy. I'm an organizer. Which is the same thing I was focused on in the Amazon campaign. Like, if you're taking a run at a big target, damn it, don't blow it. We should work really hard to win. So at Smithfield, what changed the outcome in the end was that there was actually an agreement in place, like forged through worker struggle, that happened outside of the election time. There was huge community support built, huge. I'm not talking about, DSA posters in Bessemer saying support the union. I saw them. I looked at everyone who was supporting the campaign. That ain't going to do it, last I looked in the South. So I'd like a moment when it does, but right now I'm not going to agree that it does. So in Smithfield, they built a giant infrastructure in the community. It's where Reverend Barber comes from, like, who we now know as the Poor People's Campaign, right? Like, no one knew Reverend Barber's name back then, except the workers in Smithfield, because he had just become elected the head of the state NAACP, which is an organization that, if they put out a poster in North Carolina, does actually matter to people, right? So they built a huge infrastructure. Then they had a ton of struggle. They picked issues, intermediate issues. So if this hasn't been happening in Bessemer, then I'm not going to feel, I wouldn't be putting a lot of money if the following things haven't been happening. If they haven't continued to dig really deeply on issues in the factory, in the workplace, and if they haven't been building intermediate, small fights and had workers testing their power and winning them since last March, that's not going to be a great sign about what's going to happen whenever the rerun happens. At Smithfield, a new organizing team came in who actually had a vision that said, hey, workers are really smart. We got to do some really aggressive work here. We got to have skirmishes on the shop floor. Workers have to build their confidence to believe they can overcome, at that place, the largest pork producer in the entire world, and at this place, the damn largest employer in the United States, right? And go up against the richest man in the world. So what organizing is about is helping workers develop their confidence and their self-confidence as they're going. So that has to have been happening. If there's not evidence that there's been like shop floor fights happening, that's going to be problematic. There were at Smithfield. They picked one over Martin Luther King Day becoming a holiday. I'm just trying to do my book off the top of my head. So there were like a series of issues that they began to pick. They began to poke at the issues. Safety and health violations, right? Always good. There's endless ones. I mean, we're doing this show talking about Amazon, who just killed 6 workers, right? Because it was too important to get production going when there was a tornado warning, right? And not just them, the damn candle factory and everyone else, but like, God, we're talking about records that workers had to stay at work when there were clear and present tornado warnings that a massive storm was coming. It wasn't a surprise. They just chose to keep workers working. It's like, I felt like, we're not that far from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, right? It's like workers being like told you have to come to work even though there's a tornado warning in a tornado alley in this country. Okay, I digress, but the outrage is ridiculous. So there's a whole lot of serious organizing that I hope has continued to happen, and that's going to need to happen for them to be able to have the workers feel that they can overcome a boss that was powerful enough, quite frankly, because it's a hegemonic issue, that they could even make the post office set up a post box right in front of their workplace. I mean, that's an act of serious power. And if people like the organizers, which they did in Bessemer, were walking around telling people, don't worry, there won't be a post box, or you'll have a way to vote directly and the boss won't know, and then a post box shows up, that's a damning moment in a campaign, because you've delegitimized the sort of the lead theory of the campaign, and a lot of these things were happening there. So I think it's going to be a tough campaign, honestly, at this point. That's part of why I wrote, we should not burn turf, by which I mean we should not treat any campaign as if it's okay to lose it, because it has real ramifications.
So Jane, as always, we would love to ask you questions all night, but I know that we're running up on our time with you. So I just want to close out by asking you, once we kind of cut through the media buzz and like everything that's overhyped, what are some campaigns or some victories that happened over the last year that you think were underreported that we should know more about? Obviously, you just talked about the 17,000 academic workers. I know you must have other stories tucked away. And then building off of that, what should we be paying attention to in the next year?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that you raised a couple of the really good ones, which is that it'd be really good if the media or anyone, was paying more attention to the internal democracy, sort of small d democracy movements inside of some of our major unions, because there's a relationship, although, the media is used to just calling those unions corrupt. So for them to have to acknowledge that workers are actually, holding their national organizations accountable to a different kind of a vision would probably be a challenge for a lot of reporters right now, sadly. But that's big. The academic researchers one is big. I mean, there's, May, the 1199 New England victory, where in the nursing homes, beleaguered nursing homes. I mean, I think one of the most exciting wins was back in May, where they won. It was a statewide strike threat that was credible. Okay, credible versus not credible, keywords, right? There's a lot of not credible strike threats. I would argue that the IATSE strike threat was not a credible strike threat, which is why we didn't see a strike. But in 1199 back in May, 1199 New England back in May, there was an extraordinary contract settlement where the workers, after dealing with the pandemic for a year in the nursing home industry, where people were literally dying, right? Both the residents and the workers, they said, yeah, no, we're going for a $20 minimum, and that's it. They single-handedly won the best standard again in the United States of America by saying 15 isn't enough. 20 is going to be the minimum in every nursing home contract in the state. We're going to win in these master contract fights, and we're going to bring every cook and dietary worker up to at least 18, if not 20, and get them all in the health and welfare fund and a damn pension. So this was like an extraordinary victory, and I don't think there was a single national headline about it. So you're right, Jen. We could go through like a lot of stories that deserved a lot of coverage. Like, how did this one union in this one state going up against the same national for-profit employers that a bunch of other unions, sometimes even in the same national union, go up against and can't produce anything? Why? Because they're not actually really organizing, and they're not capable of a supermajority strike threat that the bosses know is real. So there's that. And then, oh my God. And then what else is it? Well, what's exciting about 2022? What do we need to do in 2022? Is that the second question you asked me?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like, so many exciting things we have to do. What we have to do, which I just finished writing about, and it'll be published in about a week, but is a story looking at where we have contracts expiring in 2022, where we have key political races happening in 2022, the overlay between them, and how can we start, let's close on this one. How can we start to get, let's say, the better parts of the Democratic administration, or at least the unions connected to moving things within it, to understand that Biden's behavior towards workers on strike, and the whole administration's behavior, but starting with the president, that he's got to approach workers on strike as if, and we have to approach a demand about what the administration does with workers on strike, right? That's key. Nothing happens without us demanding it and trying to make it happen. That we have to understand the administration's overt and open behavior towards workers on strike, as I'm arguing, more important than the damn agency appointments that we're getting and the rulemaking that's happening behind the scenes. Essentially, the national labor movement continues to play a sort of behind the scenes insider baseball. We remove this one, we remove that one. We've got this one at Wage and Hour. We've got this one over here. We've got this commission looking at, how to, a White House commission looking at how to support organizing. And what we don't have is any visible expression where workers actually get to experience the political education of who the hell is standing up with them and for them out in public. So I actually think the idea that picket lines are equally or more important to agency heads and appointments and sort of, again, insider baseball rulemaking is like a central demand that we have to make as a movement heading into 2022. We need way more picket lines, and we need a very different approach to them from this administration, or we are going to face a brutal discussion a year from now when the House and the Senate are lost, frankly, setting up, 2024 and the possibility of a return to ongoing Trumpism, whether it's Trump or a Trumper. And I find that as the alternative to like get bold and take some damn risk, national unions. Like that's what's got to happen. It isn't just that the planet's on fire and burning down. It's that January 6th, like when I think about 2022, the other date I think about is January 6th, right? Like how the hell we're like watching a slow motion car crash happening with democracy. We see it coming. And there's clear and present strategies for how to peel a bunch of people back to our side and give them faith that showing up and doing something like voting for the Democrats versus Trumpers matters. And that would have been so different if Biden had showed up in Iowa. Let me just mention swing states. In Iowa and a handful of places where the biggest plants were in the John Deere strike. And instead we have to put up with Jen Psaki, his press aide, saying he's going to be neutral. Like there were 10,000 workers who I would argue are the exact demographic that we have to use to pull back from Trump-like forces in this country. And boy, did Biden and the administration blow the John Deere moment. So we can't afford more of that. We need national unions to be way bolder. And we know that that ain't going to happen unless workers do what the workers at John Deere did, which is have a rank and file revolt and force a different outcome from their national unions. That's what we need.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.